There's a window in the night when your body is at its most still. Usually it's somewhere between 3 and 6 in the morning. It's the part of sleep where everything slows down. Your breathing, your heart, even your awareness of the world around you. Most people pass through it without ever even noticing. But for a period of time, in a very specific group of people, something kept happening there. Young men would go to sleep, and in the middle of the night, something would go wrong. Not gradually, not in a way that anyone could predict. Witnesses described sounds that didn't make sense for someone who was asleep, struggling, choking, a kind of fear that seemed to come out of nowhere. And in some cases, those men had been describing something else in the nights leading up to it. A presence, pressure on the chest, the inability to move. Tonight, on the Midnight Drive, we're stepping into the overlap between sudden death and sleep paralysis. There's a certain kind of story that only shows up in fragments. Not because people are hiding anything, but because no one really understands what they're looking at while it's happening. This is one of those things. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, doctors and public health officials started noticing a pattern. At first, it didn't seem like a pattern at all, just isolated cases. A man dies in his sleep. No prior illnesses. No clear cause. Then another. Then another. They were young, mostly in their 20s or 30s, by all outward measures. Healthy. No history of heart disease, no warning signs that would normally point to something like this, and still, they were dying in the middle of the night. What made it harder to understand was how it happened. This wasn't quiet. It wasn't somebody simply not waking up. In many cases, there were witnesses. Family members sleeping in the same room, in the same house. They would wake up to sounds that didn't match what they expected from someone who was asleep. Gasping, choking, sometimes a kind of strained groaning. In some reports, screaming. Not the kind of scream you would expect from a nightmare that fades when someone wakes up, something much more desperate. And when they tried to wake them up, they couldn't. By the time it was over, it was already too late. Medical examinations didn't give a clear answer. Autopsies didn't show the kinds of structural problems you would expect. No obvious trauma, no poisoning, no typical signs of long-term disease, which meant there was nothing clean to point to, just a body that had stopped. At the same time, a lot of these cases were happening within Southeast Asian communities, particularly among Hmong men, who had recently resettled in the United States after the Vietnam War. That detail mattered very much, but not in the way people initially assumed. There were early attempts to explain it through environmental causes, exposure to chemicals, effects from the war, something carried over from where they had lived before. But those ideas didn't hold up under closer examination. The pattern was too specific. It was too narrow. Healthy young men, often from the same cultural background, dying in their sleep under similar circumstances. Eventually, it was given a name: Sudden Unexplained Nocturnal Death Syndrome, or SUNDS. Even the name feels like an admission. Sudden, because there was no lead up. It was all unexplained. Because there still wasn't a clear cause. Nocturnal, because it only seemed to happen during sleep. A label, more than an answer. What made it more unsettling was within these communities, the experience itself wasn't entirely unfamiliar. Not the death itself, but what seemed to come before it. There were stories. Accounts passed between families, between generations, descriptions of something that would happen in the night. A person wakes up, but not fully. They're aware of the room around them. They can see, they can hear, but they can't move. There's a pressure on the chest, a weight that makes it difficult to breathe, and often the feeling that something is there. Not just a sensation, but a full-on presence. In Hmong culture, this was sometimes described as a spirit, a nighttime visitor that sits on the chest and holds the body down. The term varies depending on translation, but the idea is consistent. Something comes to you in your sleep, and you can't fight it off. Experiences like this aren't limited to one culture. Versions of it show up all over the world. Different names, different interpretations. But the core feeling is almost identical. Awake, but not able to move. Something pressing down. A sense that you're not alone. Today, we have a clinical explanation for that. Sleep paralysis. A moment where the brain wakes up, but the body is still in paralysis state that normally happens during REM sleep. It's a built-in safety mechanism. It keeps you from physically acting out your dreams. But when the timing is off, you end up caught in between, conscious, but stuck. And because the brain is still partially in a dream state, it can fill in all of the gaps, shadows, figures, something at the edge of the room that you can't quite make out, or something much closer. Most people who experience sleep paralysis never come close to dying from it. It's intense, and it can feel very threatening, but on its own, it is not considered dangerous. That's where this story starts to become harder to hold in one piece, because in these cases, the overlap is difficult to ignore. Men who later died from sons were often described as having episodes like this, night after night. A presence, a pressure, a fear. Sometimes they talked about it openly, other times they didn't. But the pattern shows up often enough that it becomes part of the conversation. Not as proof, but as something that sits alongside everything else. There were also reports that the nights leading up to these deaths felt different, more restless, more disturbed. In some cases, what sounded like night terrors. Again, nothing you could point to and say, this is the cause, just a shift, something changing in the background. And then, at some point, between 3 and 6 in the morning, everything stops. When researchers began looking at this more closely, they started to move away from external explanations and toward something internal. Not visible in the structure of the heart, but in the way it functions. The electrical system. The signals that keep it beating in a steady rhythm. Because if those signals are disrupted, even briefly, the result can be immediate. A sudden loss of rhythm. What's known as a ventricular fibrillation. The heart doesn't pump. It just quivers. And without intervention, that state doesn't correct itself. It ends very quickly. That line of thinking would eventually lead to something more concrete. Genetic factors. Specific conditions that don't show up in routine exams. Conditions that can exist quietly without symptoms until the right moment. But at the time, none of that was clear yet. All anyone really had were the stories. The sounds of the night, the shared experience of something pressing down on the chest, and a growing number of people who went to sleep and didn't wake up. We've talked about sleep paralysis across cultures in previous episodes, and that's not holding us back from getting into the real nitty-gritty of this. Tell us your thoughts. Tell us your sleep paralysis stories in the comments below, or reach out to us and leave us a voicemail at the Midnight Drive, 402-610-2836. When something like this happens, there's a natural inclination to look outward first, to assume there's something in the environment, something new, something introduced, especially when the pattern seems tied to a specific group of people at a specific moment in time. That's where the early attention went. War exposure, chemical agents, the long-term effects of displacement and trauma. All of those were considered. And to be fair, they weren't unreasonable ideas. Many of the men affected had lived through extreme conditions. War, forced migration, the stress of rebuilding a life in a completely unfamiliar place. Those kinds of experiences don't just disappear when someone arrives somewhere new. They stay in the body. They shape how a person sleeps, how they respond to fear, how their nervous system settles or doesn't. So for a while, the working theory leaned in that direction. That maybe this was stress, pushed to a breaking point. That may be the body, under enough pressure, simply gave out during the night. But that explanation didn't fully hold, because stress, even severe stress, doesn't usually produce this kind of consistent physical outcome. It can disrupt sleep, sure, and it can increase anxiety. It can even affect heart health over time. But this was different. This was immediate, abrupt, and it followed a pattern that felt specific. So the focus started to shift away from what these men had been through and toward what might already be present in the body. Something quieter, something you wouldn't notice during the day, something that wouldn't show up on a basic medical exam. That shift led researchers into a part of the body most people don't think about unless something goes very wrong: the electrical system of the heart. When we think about the heart, we usually think in mechanical terms: pumping, blood flow, circulation. But underneath that is something else, a constant series of electrical signals, small, precise impulses that tell the heart when to contract, when to relax, and how to stay in rhythm. If those signals stay stable, the system works without you ever even noticing it, just how it's supposed to. If they don't, things can change very quickly. One of the conditions that began to emerge in connection with SUNS is something now known as Brugada syndrome. It's not something you can see just by looking at the heart. Structurally, everything can appear normal, but the electrical patterns are different, unstable in a way that doesn't always show up until the right conditions are met. In some people, that instability can lead to dangerous heart rhythms, especially during rest, especially at night. And that's where things start to line up in a way that feels less random. Brugada syndrome has been linked to changes in a gene called SCN5A. That particular gene plays a role in how electrical signals move through heart cells. If it isn't functioning the way it should be, those signals can become disrupted. Not constantly, not in a way that guarantees something will happen, but in a way that creates a kind of underlying vulnerability. A possibility, if you will. Most of the time, that possibility never becomes anything. A person can live their entire life without knowing it's there, but under certain conditions, it can surface. And when it does, it doesn't build slowly. It happens all at once. The rhythm breaks. The heart stops pumping effectively. And without immediate intervention, there is no time at all to recover. What makes this harder to sit with is how invisible it all is. There's no warning in the way people expect, no gradual decline, no clear signal that something is even wrong, just a moment where everything shifts. And for the cases linked to suns, that moment often happened during sleep. That timing matters because the body doesn't behave the same way at night as it does during the day. Heart rate slows, blood pressure drops, the nervous system shifts into a different state. And for someone with an underlying electrical instability, that environment can make those irregularities more likely to surface. It's not that sleep causes it, but sleep creates the conditions where it can happen more easily. There's also another layer that researchers have looked at, something simpler but still important. Electrolytes, things like potassium. They play a role in how electrical signals move through the body. If those levels are off, even slightly, it can affect how the heart functions. Some studies, particularly in regions where suns had been reported for generations, pointed to patterns of low potassium levels in the population. Not extreme, but enough to raise questions about whether it could contribute to the overall picture. Again, not a single cause, more like another piece of the puzzle. Another factor that, on its own, might not be enough to create a problem, but in combination with something else could increase the risk. And that seems to be where most of the research is settled, not on one explanation, but on an overlap. A genetic predisposition, an underlying electrical vulnerability, combined with conditions that make the vulnerability more likely to appear. When you look at it that way, the pattern becomes clearer. Why it affected certain populations more than others. Why it appeared suddenly, then seemed to fade over time. But even with that understanding, there's still something about it that feels unfinished. Because it doesn't fully explain the experience people were having before it happened. The fear, the sense of something pressing down on the chest, the reports of waking up unable to move, convinced that something was in the room. From a medical standpoint, those experiences line up cleanly with sleep paralysis, a known condition, a known mechanism. The brain wakes up while the body is still in REM atonia. The result is a temporary inability to move, often paired with vivid, sometimes terrifying, hallucinations. That part is well documented. It happens across cultures. It happens across age groups. And in most cases, it ends without any kind of lasting harm. But in this context, it showed up differently. Not as an isolated experience, but as something that seems to repeat, to build, to carry weight. And it's important to be careful here, because it's easy to draw a straight line between two things that appear next to each other, even when that line hasn't been fully proven. What can be said is this: sleep paralysis itself is not considered dangerous. It does not, on its own, cause death. But in rare and very specific situations, the conditions around it might overlap with something else, something already present, something unseen. And when those things line up in just the right way, the outcome can look sudden, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling. Over time, as awareness of conditions like Brugada syndrome have increased, the number of these unexplained cases has gone way down. Not because the risk has completely disappeared, but because it's better understood, it's better screened, it's better managed when it's identified early. Which shifts the story out of the category of mystery and into something else. A moment where a pattern appeared before we had the tools to fully explain it. Where cultural experience, personal fear, and underlying biology all overlapped in a way that felt impossible to separate. And even now, with more questions than there used to be, there's still a part that lingers. Not in the cause of death, but in the experience leading up to it. That space between sleep and waking, where the body is still but the mind is not. And something feels close. Much closer than it should be. You're listening to The Midnight Drive. So there is a point where explanation starts to feel complete on paper. You can trace the mechanism. You can name the condition. You can point to the gene, the electrical signal, the exact moment where the rhythm breaks. And in a clinical sense, that's enough. But it doesn't always match how something feels when you're inside it. Because the experience people described before these deaths didn't feel clinical, it felt very personal. It felt very immediate. And in a way, that shows up across cultures. It's familiar. Sleep paralysis sits in a strange place. It's one of the most documented sleep-related experiences we have, and at the same time, it's one of the most consistently misunderstood. Part of that comes from how it presents. You don't just wake up and realize you can't move. You wake up into it. Half in your room, half somewhere else. Your eyes are open, or at least it feels that way. You can see the outline of things that you recognize. The door, the ceiling, the corner of the room where shadows tend to collect. But something is off. Your body doesn't respond. Not your arms, not your legs, sometimes not even your voice. And then there's the pressure. That's the part almost everybody agrees on. Some kind of weight on the chest. Not sharp, not sudden, it's just there. It's heavy enough that breathing feels very shallow and controlled. Like you have to think about each breath instead of just letting it happen. For some people, that's where it ends. Confusion, fear, then it passes. But for others, there's something else layered into it. That sense that you're not alone. And that's where things start to take shape. Not always clearly. Sometimes it's just a feeling, a presence in the room, something standing just outside your sight line. Other times it's more defined, a figure at the foot of the bed, something sitting on the chest, a shape in the doorway that wasn't there before. The details change depending on who you ask, but the structure of the experience stays almost identical. And that consistency is part of what makes all of this so compelling. Because it suggests that whatever is happening, it's rooted in the way the brain processes that in-between state. Not necessarily in something external, but in something shared. Across geography, across culture, across time. Different cultures have given it different names. In parts of Southeast Asia, it's described as a spirit that presses down on the chest. In other places, it becomes a witch, a shadow person, an intruder. In some modern accounts, it shifts into something more technological. Alien figures, abduction scenarios. The form changes, but the feeling stays the same. Awake, unable to move. Something's close. Something's watching. And a level of fear that feels out of proportion to the moment. From a medical standpoint, that fear has an explanation. During REM sleep, the brain is highly active. Dream imagery is vivid. Emotions are heightened. At the same time, the body is intentionally paralyzed. It's a protective mechanism. If that system misfires and consciousness comes online too early, you end up experiencing both at once. Awareness paired with paralysis. And because the brain is still partly dreaming, it tries to make sense of the situation. It fills in the gaps. It turns sensations into images. It turns uncertainty into something that feels real. That's why the experiences can feel so convincing. Not like a dream, but like something happening in the room with you. For most people, the experience is temporary, unpleasant, sometimes deeply unsettling, but it's not dangerous. It passes. The body reconnects. Movement returns. and the moment fades into something you can explain later, even if it didn't feel explainable at the time. But in the context of what we've been talking about, there's another layer, because for some of the men affected by suns, these experiences didn't seem isolated. They repeated night after night after night, or at least often enough to leave an impression, enough to be talked about, and in some cases, enough to be feared. And that fear matters. Not because it proves anything, but because of how the body responds to it. Fear isn't just a thought, it's physical. Your heart rate increases. Your breathing shifts. Your stress hormones rise. The body prepares for something, even if there's nothing there. During a sleep paralysis episode, that response can feel amplified because you can't move. You can't interrupt it. You're forced to sit inside of it until it passes. And for someone experiencing that repeatedly, the anticipation alone can start to change how they approach sleep altogether. Going to bed becomes something to brace for. Waking up in the night becomes something to dread. The line between rest and threat starts to blur. There have been theories that try to connect that state directly to what happened in suns. That the fear itself might trigger something in the body, that the stress response combined with an underlying vulnerability in the heart could create the conditions for a fatal rhythm disturbance. But that connection hasn't been fully proven, and it's important to keep that line clear, because sleep paralysis on its own does not cause death. It's not dangerous in that way. What it can do is create an experience that feels dangerous, that convinces you in the moment that something is very wrong. And if something else is already present in the body, something quiet, something undetected, then that overlap becomes harder to separate. That's also the role of belief, not in a dismissive way, but in a human one. If you grow up hearing that this experience is caused by a spirit, something that's visiting you at night, something that can and will harm you, then the experience itself carries much more weight. It becomes more than a strange moment in the brain, and it becomes something with intention, something directed. And that can shape how the body reacts. How much fear is present. How long that fear lingers after the moment has finished. Some researchers have suggested that this kind of belief could amplify the stress response during sleep paralysis, not creating the condition, but intensifying the experience. Again, not a direct cause, but part of a larger picture. And that idea can feel very uncomfortable, because it sits in a space between explanation and experience, between what we can measure and what we feel. The challenge is holding both without collapsing one into the other. Recognizing that the experience is real, the fear is real, the physical sensations are real, even if the source isn't what it seems in the moment. And at the same time, recognizing the body has its own systems, its own patterns, its own points of failure that don't always announce themselves ahead of time. When you place those things side by side, something starts to take shape. Not a clean answer necessarily, but a clearer frame. A group of people with a specific underlying vulnerability, experiencing a known but very intense sleep condition. Within a cultural context, that gives a condition a particular meaning. And somewhere in that overlap, something happens. Not every time, not even most of the time, but enough to be remembered. Enough to leave behind a pattern that, for a while, didn't make any sense. And even now, with more understanding than there used to be. There's still a part of the experience that doesn't fully resolve. That moment where you wake up and can't move. Where the room looks the same but feels different. Where something seems close, even if nothing is there. It's a common experience, a well-documented one. And still, when you're inside it, it doesn't feel common at all. When was the last time you had a sleep paralysis episode? I would love to hear about it. please let me know in the comments below wherever you're listening, or feel free to reach out to us at the Midnight Drive. Leave us a message, 402-610-2836. Now, I think it goes without saying, there's a certain kind of relief that comes with understanding something, right? Anything, really. Even if the answer isn't very simple. Even if it doesn't explain every single part of the experience. Just having a place to stand. A way to say, this is what we know, and this is where the uncertainty begins. That matters. And in this case, we do have more of that than we used to. What was once grouped together under a name that mostly described confusion, SUNS, or Sudden Unexplained Nocturnal Death Syndrome, has, over time, been broken apart into things we can actually point to. Underlying heart conditions, electrical instability, genetic patterns that don't show up until the right moment. Better screening has made a huge difference. So has awareness. What used to feel sudden and untraceable is now, at least in some cases, something that can be identified ahead of time. Not always, but more often than it was before. Which changes the shape of the story. It moves it out of the category of something unknown and into something that was, for a time, not yet understood. There was a gap in our knowledge, rather than it being something outside of it. And still, there's a reason this doesn't feel like a closed case, because the part that stays with people isn't just the outcome. It's the experience of it all leading up to it. That moment in the night, that feeling of waking up and not being able to move, the pressure on the chest, the sense that something is there. Even when you know intellectually what sleep paralysis is, that doesn't always change how it feels. It doesn't stop your body from reacting. It doesn't stop the fear from rising. And that's something I keep coming back to. The difference between knowing something and experiencing it. Because those are not the same thing. You can understand the mechanism, sure. You can know that your body is in a temporary state, sure. You can remind yourself that it'll pass, sure. And still, in that moment, it can feel like something is very wrong. That tension shows up in a lot of areas of life. But it's especially clear here, where the explanation is grounded, well studied, and the experience still feels like something else entirely. There's also something to be said about how much context shapes what we feel in these moments. If you grow up hearing that sleep paralysis is just a glitch in the brain, that it's harmless, even if it's uncomfortable, then the experience, while still intense, has somewhere to land. A way to process it after the fact. But if you grow up hearing that it's something visiting you, something with intention, then that same experience carries a much different weight. Not because one version is more real than the other, but because belief changes how the body responds. How long the fear lingers. How much meaning gets attached to the moment. And that doesn't make anyone irrational, it makes them human. We all interpret our experiences through whatever framework we've been given, or the one we've built for ourselves over time. For me, sleep paralysis was something that showed up often enough to become familiar. Not welcome, but familiar. That in-between state, the awareness without control, the pressure. I could even tell when it was going to come on because I would get a high-pitched whining in my ears that would turn into a loud static. And it was almost like a preview to what was to come. It was like clockwork. When it was going to happen, it always started the same. I ended up doing a sleep study, and my sleep paralysis episode happened right in the middle of the study. and they were able to clock that I was not breathing. And so they gave me a CPAP machine. They diagnosed me with sleep apnea. And since I've started using the machine, it hasn't happened since. Sleep patterns. Breathing. The kinds of things that don't feel important until they are. That doesn't mean it works that way for everyone. But it does point to something simple. The body is responsive. More than we sometimes give it credit for. And that applies here too, because when we step back and look at everything together, this isn't really a story about something hunting people in their sleep. It's a story about overlap, about what happens when multiple systems line up in a way that isn't obvious at first. A heart with a hidden vulnerability. A state of sleep that creates a very specific kind of experience. A cultural framework that gives that experience some kind of meaning. And a moment in time where those things intersected often enough to be noticed. That doesn't make it any less unsettling. If anything, it shifts the unease into a different place. Away from something external and into something closer, something internal. Something that can exist quietly without announcing itself. That idea can sit with you for a while. The thought that your body can carry things you're not aware of. That most of the time, everything works the way it should. And sometimes, under very specific conditions, it doesn't. Not gradually, not without warning, just a shift. And that's uncomfortable, but it's also very real. At the same time, there's another layer to this feeling that feels worth holding on to. Because even with all of that, sleep paralysis itself is not dangerous. Keep coming back to that. It feels dangerous. It can feel overwhelming, but it isn't something that actually harms the body. And that distinction matters so much, especially when fear has a way of building on itself, of turning one experience into something much bigger than it actually is. There's a balance here between respecting how intense the moment can feel and not letting it become something that it isn't. Between acknowledging the stories and understanding the mechanisms between the experience and the explanation. And maybe that's where this kind of story does settle. Not in a clean conclusion, but in that balance, where you can hold both things at once. The science and the feeling. The explanation and the memory of what it's like to be there, in the dark, unable to move, waiting for your body to catch up. Most nights, nothing happens. The body moves through its cycles. The heart keeps its rhythm. Morning comes. But every now and then, something interrupts that. Even if it's just for a few seconds. Even if it ends without consequence. And in that moment, it can feel like you're much closer to something that you don't fully understand. Not because it's outside of you, but because it's happening inside. In a space you don't usually have access to. That space between sleep and waking. Where things are quiet. Where the body is still. And where, for just a moment, everything feels a little less certain.